All right, we're going to start the webinar. So welcome everybody to episode 5 in our Women's Power to Stop War webinar series, The Political Economy of Violence Against Women. My name is Emma Bergerser. I'm the International Anniversary Coordinator of WILPF. I will just take you through a few technical issues and some of the background of this series, and then I'll hand you off to Barbara and Jacqui. So to start with some technical issues. First of all, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the webinar format, you are all muted and we cannot see you on the webcam as participants. That is normal. That is the way the program works. As long as you can hear me and see the screen, that is all you need. At the end of the session, we will have a lot of time for questions and answers. I will tell you then again how to do that, but it's by raising your hand button or typing in a question in the question box on your screen. Also, if something goes wrong during the webinar, if your computer maybe freezes or you're having some technical issues on your side, you can try to just log out and log in again using the same link that you've used. And finally, we are recording this session, so please keep that in mind. If you do choose to ask some questions, you will be recorded. So a little bit about us and why we're doing this webinar series. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is the longest serving women's peace organization in the world. And just to prove that, we are turning 100 years old next year, which we are celebrating in a really, really big way. We are organizing a major international conference in The Hague next year from the 27th till the 29th of April. Under the banner Women's Power to Stop War. The Women's Power to Stop War is all about connecting, strengthening, and celebrating the work of women peacemakers from all over the world, and we will all come together in The Hague next year. So it's a great place for you also to come together. An important update for you, for those of you that are interested in the conference, we have the early bird registration discount ending this month. So for those of you that are interested in coming, we recommend that you take advantage of that discount and register yourself today. You can do so on the website womenstopwar.org at the conference home. Also, another important update is our call for proposals. Women's Power to Stop War is not just about WILPF, but it's, like I said, celebrating all these women peacemakers from around the world. And we want to hear from lots of NGOs that are doing great work, whether it's on human rights or gender or social justice or anything in between, disarmament. So we welcome you all to submit your proposals for organizing side events. The first proposal deadline is also at the end of this month on August 31st. That does not mean that if you make a proposal afterwards, you don't get in, but if you make it before this deadline, you have the best chance of getting your session in. If you know that you want to do something, but you're not ready to make a full proposal, just send us an email so we can keep you in mind during programming. All right, so that's it for me and my shameless plugging. So now I will give the floor to our fantastic Barbara Chojanowska, the coordinator of the academic network. Barbara, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 5th webinar hosted by the Academic Network of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. For those of you who join us for the first time today, I would like to start with a few words about the network. So the WILPF Academic Network is a think tank that addresses the issues of gender, peace, and security with the aim to connect a global network of academics and peace activists, because our goal is to better the integration of academic expertise into political actions through sharing knowledge, for example, at events like this one. And the academic network is comprised of university professors, PhD candidates, and independent independent researchers, and they all are experts in some areas of the women, peace and security agenda. And the network has now opened to new members, so if you are interested in joining, you can refer to our webpage, webinternational.org/academic network, and you will find there all the information you need to join. And we've just admitted a new member, Dr. Claire Duncanson. And Claire is a lecturer of international relations at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And she is interested in international security, international relations, and gender and politics. And you will definitely have a chance to hear more about her work at a webinar in the future. But today, our special guest is Jacqui True. Jacqui is a professor of politics and international relations at Monash University in Australia. She's a specialist in gender and international relations and the women, peace and security agenda. In particular, she focuses on the political economy dimensions of peace building and the long-term prevention of violence. Her most recent book, The Political Economy of Violence Against Women, received the American Political Science Association's award for the best book in human rights. So I hope Jacqui will be able to tell us more about the book. Jacqui, the floor is yours.
Well, hello everybody. It's good morning here from me, but good evening to you if you're in the Western Hemisphere. It's a real pleasure to be presenting the seminar today. I'm just going to share my webcam. Okay, great. I hope that the connection will go smoothly, and if not, there might just be a short delay where I kind of reboot the webinar from my end. I'd like to start by just saying that I passionately believe that a political economy analysis can help us to understand the root causes of violence against women and girls, of sexual and gender-based violence, also perpetrated against men and boys, and it can help us to understand why and where this violence increases, and how we can develop different strategies and interventions to prevent this violence. So that's the point. It's not just an academic analysis. I think it has direct purchase on our prevention strategies. So Barbara, do you have the slides for the seminar? I can't see them, so it's not. I'm not sure when you will go ahead with those.
Yeah, we've got the slide up there, so don't worry, we'll follow.
So everybody, so if I want to change the slides, so which slide do you have? Because
right now we have ending violence against women and the quote from Irene Khan, and just let me know when you want to go to the next one.
Okay, fantastic. I'll let you know. So this is a fantastic quote, I think, from Irene Khan, and really here she's arguing that the cycles of poverty and violence fuel and perpetuate one another. And I think this really directs our attention to that mutual relationship between women's socioeconomic position relative to men and their vulnerability to violence. You can go to the next slide, Barbara. Thanks. So today I just want to really try to explain to you what I think are the key elements of a political economy analysis of violence against women and girls. And then I want to just show empirically some of the links and connections between, I think, what many of you will already understand as intimately related, and that is the relationship between gender equality or gender inequalities and the likelihood of violence against women and girls, the vulnerability to violence. And then I want to talk about what we should do about violence and thinking about prevention strategies that might be suggested or implied by a political economy analysis. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Barbara. So hopefully this one is really, I think that what a political economy analysis in particular shows is that economic and political inequalities between women and men are reinforced in many ways by global economic conditions, by the liberalization of economies, the integration through trade and financial investment, and also by globalized networks of weapons and other assets, all of which, insofar as they are not ameliorating those inequalities between men and women, are also increasing the risks for violence for women and girls. And so the perspective here is that that it is these global conditions that put women in precarious situations that make them much more vulnerable to violence, men's violence, than many men. And that might be situations of work, situations where their inequality in the household relative to their intimate partner or other family members is relatively unequal. It may also be in situations of migration or conflict where women seek different strategies for themselves and their families to survive. So I would like to say that that this analysis, really looking at the kind of the globalized causes of violence, really can allow us to address a range of different forms of violence against women and girls. So in my book, I look at conflict, at post-conflict situations, at situations after disaster or humanitarian natural disasters. I look at migration, the reasons for migration, and the kind of vulnerability to violence experienced during migration. I also look at the effects of economic and financial crisis, especially after the global financial crisis, and also situations of transition, of integration with global markets and of liberalization, and how those perpetuate and create new conditions for vulnerability to violence. So hopefully in the seminar I'll be a bit more concrete about all of those. And I also just want to say here that what this perspective does, and I think many activists on violence against women have been saying this for many years, is that it addresses violence as not just an abrogation of civil and political rights, but also importantly of economic, social and cultural rights, and noting that women's failure to achieve equal economic and social rights, access to resources, is precisely why they find themselves so vulnerable and to violence, especially men's violence. And lastly, before we go to the next slide, Barbara, I would also say that by and large, the frameworks that we have globally and nationally and locally to address violence against women with respect to laws and policies, most of these do not extend to the economic sphere, to the material conditions of women's lives, and they don't explore the political and economic causes of this violence. So many of our approaches are kind of addressing symptoms rather than root causes, and as a result, it's not surprising that we are so frustrated that we can't seem to ever really come close to eliminating violence against women and girls. Thanks, Barbara. And I'll go to the next slide now. This is just an image of women activists, the first political protest in Kabul against sexual harassment in the streets. Because, of course, in many countries around the world, women are not just facing violence in the home or in the so-called private sphere, but increasingly violence in the public sphere with an intent to push women out of public space. And here I just might note that although we don't have any kind of institutional policy framework at the global level that looks at the political economic causes of violence, we have CEDAW, and the CEDAW committee continually does comment on the socioeconomic causes of violence against women. For example, they've recognized the linkages between violence and particularly trafficking, domestic violence and exploitation, and women's lack of enjoyment of economic and social rights. And a number of their reports kind of comment on this link. And they've also commented on the effects of the financial and economic crisis on the full realization of women's human rights. And they predicted an increase in societal and domestic violence against women as a result of that economic crisis. So they make these comments, but I would say that overall, globally, we don't really have a systematic analysis of the socioeconomic conditions that might produce or increase violence against women. And yet, I think we do have a lot of research that shows us how something like an economic crisis would increase the risk factors for violence, so that we know actually before such a financial collapse happens, what is going to be the likely impact. Next slide, please, Barbara. So just to make a similar point again, that the role of economic power and structures in reinforcing gender inequalities and how these manifest in increasing conflict and women's specific vulnerability to violence. And this is to say that violence has a material basis. It's not just physical, it's deeply material, rooted in structural inequalities. And for women, this is rooted in gendered, social and economic inequalities. And these inequalities, as we've seen in recent years, are heightened by destabilizing economic policies, the stress of structural adjustment policies that is put on households and communities, the displacement as a result of liberalization and investment, large-scale developments that displace people, the quest for survival by migrating to urban areas, and the poor living conditions that result from that migration. Let me just see, I'm losing my, okay. And the poverty and deprivation that also can result from liberalization, where some sectors are, of course, increasingly redundant, people lose their jobs, their forms of livelihood, and their access to the resources that come from that income or employment. And I might also say here, by linking the role of economic power and structures, I think it's really important to understand that that there is also a connection here to conflict, and we can see that gender discrimination in economic opportunities, in political representation, and persistent discrimination in society is also, in some contexts, an early warning indicator for more generalized violence and conflict, and even genocide and mass atrocities. The UN Secretary General, in his 2013 report on the responsibility to protect and prevent atrocities and conflicts, noted how gender discrimination practices that involve the denial or adequate protection of basic rights and unequal access to services and property can actually be indicate the likelihood of the use of sexual and gender-based violence to perpetrate genocide and other atrocities. Next slide, thanks, Barbara. So the point here is that the political economy analysis can address situations inside and outside of conflict, situations within developing countries, within developed countries, and it has purchase really across all of those contexts. And the point of having such perspective, next slide please, Barbara, is to really kind of try to develop strategies, obviously targeted toward different contexts, but that can really address violence in a way that helps us to save more than one woman or one girl at a time. So I might just note that, as I said, so far the frameworks that we have really don't fully address this socioeconomic context, and that creates vulnerability to violence. And so most of our high-profile global initiatives are disconnected from efforts to empower women economically and politically. So you can just think here of simply the fact that the Millennium Development Goals had no goal on violence or on eliminating violence. I know that's very much on the agenda for the post-2015 development goals. We can also see then that this in other ways, and yet I'll come back to that point. We can also see that the way we even measure gender equality, that when we look at gender equality, we look at political participation, we look at economic participation, we look at education, we look at other kinds of social status and rights, but we actually hardly ever integrate into our indicators any kind of prevalence of violence. So it's hard to actually even have a picture of gender equality if we don't take into account the situations of violence that women and girls experience. So we treat these as separate things when we look at women's empowerment. And then if we actually look at the efforts to address violence against women, we see even in the UN interagency campaign, for example, we see very little link to the kind of structural analysis of trade policies, of financial policies, and other parts of the UN system to link that experience of social and economic inequality and violence. So I guess the next point, hopefully on the slide, is that, you know, we do know that when women have access to productive resources and a good social status, they are less vulnerable to violence across all societies. And I think this is a really profound thing that we know. And we can see this, that when women do, for example, have rights to property, to income generation, to employment, to housing, food, and health, they're far less likely, from all of the research that all of us have contributed to over the years, that women are less likely to be experiencing violence. And there's, you know, some different studies I might highlight here. I mean, I think one very persuasive study by Beena Agarwal from 2 provinces in India sort of quite simply shows that when women either own property, income generating property, or their own home, they have a 50% less, they're 50% less likely to experience domestic violence, intimate partner violence. So that in a way, having that that property, it gives women an economic status in the household, and they're able to bargain with partners in a way that that is a deterrent to violence. And I think there are other studies that show this too. I mean, obviously, one source of violence is also the conflict between men and women over money, over resources. And so if you have your own money, resources, that obviously one source of potential violence may be prevented. However, I mean, there are that's a little simplistic. We might also say that there is a chance that once women do have economic resources, there can be further violence, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So maybe so the third point here is just to say that, you know, currently we have a disunity among UN agencies, international agencies, and even among academics and scholars in terms of the ways that we understand and address the problem of violence against women and girls. And that we tend to separate out. We tend to address the civil and political rights or the physical violence in that context rather than in the context, as Irene Khan said, of the right to housing, the right to food, the right to basic needs. So the key challenge then, the next slide, is how we can transcend divisions and inspire new research and research-based action to prevent violence. Just another image, and we'll go straight to the next slide on determinants of violence against women. So many of those working in the area of violence against women use what they call an ecological model to explain the different levels of causes of violence, from the household, the family, to the community and neighborhood, and to the broader society. And certainly the ecological model includes societal structures when they sort of try to understand the risks for violence and the prevalence of violence for individual victims and perpetrators, but also to understand the preventative conditions. But if we look at this, all of the research that we have, most of our research, especially coming from fields like psychology, public health, criminology, criminal justice, is mostly focused on risk factors for individuals, not risk factors for societies. And certainly less on preventative factors. What are the good conditions, the resilient conditions that we should learn about to share and to build up to eliminate violence. And a lot of the research and policies on protection from violence and prosecution of violence and not on prevention. So I kind of highlight that box there, looking at how the kind of broader economic, social, and political conditions themselves are these structural conditions for the prevention of violence. And that I think the World Health Organization also kind of notes this is a major gap that we need to focus on. And women's movements themselves need to focus on this because a lot of the violence against women movement has been focused on seeking legal and policy redress rather than being linked to social and economic justice movements, which are, of course, looking at the broader causes of violence, why men perpetrate violence, and not just why women are victimized by violence. And so, you know, understanding how violence becomes a social relationship within groups. So to the next slide, please. So if we look here at some of these broader preventative factors that we can see from different studies, we can see that we do know some of the direct and indirect causal mechanisms for violence and how they might inform different policy interventions. So here we have things like property and land rights, which I've also mentioned, and I think that here we can also see that access to land rights and housing, especially in situations of migration to the city, across from conflict areas to refugee camps to countries of resettlement, make women very vulnerable to systemic violence throughout their lifetime. So that something like securing the right to housing might be very, very important as a prevention strategy. And I know that there is some excellent work being done on this around the right to housing and violence. We can also see all of these things, of course, need to be taken together and not simply disaggregated with one strategy focused on to the exclusion of others. So we can see, for example, that in studies that we can actually see continuing levels of violence against women even when women have a very good education and have gender equality in secondary education. So that education without kind of economic opportunities for income and for employment mean that women are not, are just as likely to be vulnerable to violence. And we can also see the importance of norms around violence also themselves being a structural condition which comes out of the observation of women being unequal to men in many situations, and therefore societies being able to accept the use of violence against women and girls who are, structurally unequal and inferior. Look at the next slide. Thanks, Barbara. So if we think back to the sort of thinking about the impacts of global changes, and especially changes in the global economy, in the types of production and the types of consumption, we can also see how that violence against women, which in some societies might be seen as domestic violence primarily or private sphere matter, is actually part of a broader structure of global power relations. So we can see how that the gender structure of discrimination, how women's bodies and labour become very crucial to the expansion of markets, especially if we think about new and rising economies where women are a large part of the manufacturing workforce, especially employed by multinational corporations, And we see the way in which women as consumers are really targeted by corporations to expand consumer markets, and the way in which gendered and sexualized representations are really promoted as part of that market expansion, and how then that kind of reinforces certain attitudes and norms around violence toward women in the context of also kind of destabilized economic conditions where people are finding it harder to survive and to make a good livelihood. So, I mean, I think that it's really important to not see violence against women as perpetuated through backward or traditional attitudes toward women, but rather also to look at the ways in which our most sophisticated, most powerful global capitalist market is also promoting quite violent images of women, and of course those of us who know something about the globalized sex industry and sex trade will know that this is a large part of the global economy, and so and the expansion of the global economy. And I think we need to understand that alongside understanding the phenomenon of violence against women, which we see actually no sense that it is decreasing in any society in the world. So next slide, please, Barbara. Okay. So there are patterns, and these the causes and consequences of violence against women are linked to global transformations, economic, political, military, and natural environmental forces. I think the environmental context there is really important, just to note that that environmental disasters are related to, obviously, the way in which we are generating economic production, and that we can expect to see more environmental disasters as a result. And what we know is that from already excellent research done, that women and girls are also much more vulnerable to violence after disaster, in part because of the more precarious situation with respect to economic and social rights that they are in. So I think after the Asian tsunami, there was women and girls died at 14 times the rate of men and boys, in part because of that unequal situation, that they were less able to find shelter, they were not able to swim. There are many ways in which their situation affected their ability to survive that disaster. And I think we can also see that in more recent disasters, but we can also see comparisons in societies where societies have relatively more gendered equality. There are actually systems to address violence. So one example might be, I'll just quickly give this one. I did a comparison of the earthquake in Haiti and the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand, both actually similar magnitude. However, of course, very different impact because very different societies and levels of development. And we could focus on that, and that obviously relates directly to the deaths from those disasters. But what was most interesting to see is that that in Christchurch, even though there weren't formal policies to kind of, or even checklists or frameworks to address violence against women in the aftermath of the earthquake, because there were such good relationships between battered women's shelters, the police, the civil protection agency, that actually they actually did respond to find alternative shelters for women and to anticipate violence increased violence in those places where people fled after the earthquake. So, and of course in Haiti, many of those who could have been in a position to roll out services were themselves badly affected. And I think another example would be also to think about the way in which financial crisis and the impact of austerity policies as a response to that financial crisis in peaceful societies actually has had a disproportionate impact in and increasing those risk factors for violence against women. So the disproportionate loss of women's jobs in some societies, the removal or the downsizing of state services that support women's employment and female-headed households, and all of those kind of things, which are also putting women in a situation where they're more vulnerable to violence, where they have to take on forms of work where harassment is more likely to be experienced, where they have extreme financial stress, which also can increase the risk factors for domestic violence. And this is, of course, all happening if we think about a society like the United Kingdom, at the same time that the United Kingdom is very focused on preventing sexual violence in conflict in other countries, whilst scaling back their support for survivors of women survivors of violence in their own societies. So we can see also quite contradictory efforts happening, despite there being some patterns in the similar causes of violence within and across societies. Next slide, Barbara, thanks. And another example I might go to in the context of post-conflict, we can also see here how the approach might be to not understand the different experiences of war and conflict and how that might affect women differently than men in the peace building phase, where there is an explicit attempt to promote economic recovery and also to rebuild political institutions. And so in that post-conflict moment, by and large, we see a real disconnect between the political and security pillars of peace building and the economic and social, or the pillars of security. And that the privileging of national security and electoral machinery over human security has a particularly negative impact on women and girls' security. And it's pretty clear that if you don't address these underlying social and economic rights, this women's access to jobs, to livelihoods, and to resources in the post-conflict moment, then their vulnerability to violence continues in peacetime. And that, you know, there's been a number of comments that sexual violence, for example, spikes in the post-conflict moment, and we can understand that by understanding that the post-conflict policies and frameworks are largely still addressing men's experience of war, either as combatants or as those who need to be involved in the rebuilding of society. So employment programs and projects targeted at men, not or so-called gender-neutral programs that are primarily benefiting men. So these all end up increasing the risk factors for violence against women. So even in a society like Rwanda, which might be lauded as having so many women in political representation, we can also see still very high levels of violence and of poverty in female-headed households in that society. Okay, so on to the next slide, thanks. And yet, at the same time, if we think about the prevention strategies targeted at conflict and post-conflict societies, they are very focused on prosecution of perpetrators, of bringing justice through the rule of law, but to a much lesser degree addressing the structure of the victims, which is how to allow them to move on and to attain social and economic status, so that they are able to avoid situations of violence, so they're able to flee situations of violence in their homes and communities, or support their own families without resort to precarious work, including in some situations migrating, trafficking, and so on. Okay, so just to sum up that example, that we've seen states when they have responded to violence against women in the post-conflict situation, they've tended to focus on legal prosecution and on reforming juridical structures, and less on alteration in economic and social structures, and less on altering economic and social programs in the post-conflict context. Okay, so those have been the donor priorities. So let me just explore a little bit further the really overarching argument that that violence against women and girls is actually a symptom of structural gender inequalities. So, of course, I think this is, we do need more rigorous research to support this hypothesis about the causes of violence, but one of the strongest risk factors I think many policymakers and advocates would agree on is that violence against women and girls at all levels is really much more likely in situations where the power between men and women is unequal and you know, and particularly skewed, and that it is agreed, and certainly it has. There's a United Nations General Assembly resolution on this in 2010 that addressing unequal power through economic, social, and political empowerment of women and girls is one of the main responsibilities for governments with respect to the prevention of violence. So, next slide, thanks. We know that, and there's a lot of focus on women's empowerment as contributing to economic development, but we focus less on this fact that poor women are more vulnerable to violence, and that the experience of violence also makes it much more difficult for women to participate economically and politically, and I think that it's, this point has been lost when we note that all different types of women from all societies and all social classes and experiences have encountered violence. And that is true, but it also misses the point that some women are more vulnerable, and certainly poor women are more vulnerable because they have less alternatives. If they do encounter violence, they may not be able to leave for the sheer fact of not having a place to live, not having an income, but for other reasons as well. And I think that it's important to note that there is good research showing that that women in the lowest quartiles do experience more domestic violence, and also some research that suggests women at the very bottom it may experience less violence, partly because violence is not needed as a strategy to keep them in their position, because it is so disempowered. Next slide, thanks. So I think that without necessarily focusing on women's empowerment as a means to the end of economic development, I think we can see that the prevention of violence is really a strategy that would reinforce our efforts to promote economic development, and that that these different policy frameworks really should be brought together, because there is good research that women's economic empowerment can be a deterrent to violence. Next slide, please. Okay, but I wanted to complicate this point, as I indicated earlier, that it's not a straightforward relationship that if you're more economically empowered, you'll necessarily encounter less violence, because of course much of the violence that we see is also happening to women who have a rising social and economic status. If we think about societies like Bangladesh and Pakistan with the acid burnings that women are encountering, the sexual violence in the public sphere, we can also see that as women are assuming non-traditional roles and are gaining greater access to socio and economic opportunities, especially through employment and manufacturing industries, that this may constitute a threat to social structures and to some men who may experience women's rising status as a loss of their entitlement to employment, to higher status. And so, you know, in some situations we can see that one step forward for women may also be result in increased violence. And we can even see this in developed countries as well. So that it's not enough to just one-to-one link women's empowerment economically with as a prevention strategy. And I think this is where the studies that people like Neela Kabir have done on microfinance and the need to address not only microfinance but actually attitudes to gender equality, attitudes toward human rights within communities is really important alongside any kind of economic initiatives. And also, I would add to that anti-violence programs within secondary schools, which have been shown to be quite effective in lowering rates of violence among those groups that receive that education. So next slide. So this case of Bring Back the Girls from Nigeria just kind of reminds us that how that educated girls can be victims and targeted victims of violence, and that education is really, really important, but it's not enough. And we have seen a massive expansion of women's education worldwide, and we've seen some expansion of women's economic status in some parts of the world, but we have still limited political agency and political representation of women to be able to address an overall holistic approach to women's empowerment to prevent violence. Next slide. So I've kind of already made this point that women's increasing independence might be viewed as a threat and may, in some societies, in some contexts, lead to increased male violence. And I think there are also studies which show when a male partner is unemployed, especially when the female partner is employed, that there also can be increased violence. And some surveys from the United States show this. I think South Africa, there's also been some very good qualitative research looking at rape perpetrators and how gang rape also is also a product of disenfranchised young men. So I think that we need to think about both men and women when we're thinking about prevention strategies. We need to think about changing masculinities and engaging men. But by the same token, when we're thinking about preventing sexual violence in conflict situations, we also need to think about the structures that women and girls face in those societies, and especially in the post-conflict moment. Next slide, thanks. And this slide, which comes from UN Women's Progress of the World's Women report, is just to remind us that based on even the relatively incomplete data we do have on prevalence of intimate partner violence, that in countries that have achieved or come closer to gender equality, there is a slightly lower prevalence rate for violence. So I mean, we can't completely. I think we can just look at the pattern there, even though knowing that data is not perfect, is not as rigorous as we'd like it to be. But we can see that there is a relationship that promoting gender equality in our economic, social, and political dimensions is associated with lower prevalence of intimate partner violence, and I think that we could probably do the same for sexual violence, and if we think about other forms of violence. Next slide. So, and that relationship there also has been looked at by looking at the World Health data on the prevalence of domestic violence and sexual violence, just two types. and looking simply at the country scores on gender equality and seeing that the relationship there is also quite close. One thing I did, I just want to quickly go through this, and it's really not, again, I think because we don't have really good data, none of this analysis can be, quite as credible as we might like. But I just looked at the OECD's Social Institutions and Gender Index, SGBV, in 2009 and 2012 that it was reported for. And I just looked at a few different forms of what we might consider, especially under the United Nations Declaration, violence. So looking at female genital mutilation, polygamy, infanticide, early marriage, and lack of freedom of movement, as well as the variable which looks at whether countries have a law against violence against women. And it's just very interesting to think about what explains the different reported levels of those different types of violence in the more than 150 developing countries that are in the SGBV index. Next slide. And so we because there's some the SGBV is probably, I would say, the best database for looking at gender discrimination and trying to understand some of the institutional causes of that discrimination. And in using the index in a way that certainly wasn't intended by those who put it together, I just looked at, thinking about, well, what is the relationship between prevalence of those different types of violence and women's access to public space and voice, economic rights, access to land, credit, and property in the SGBV index, equal secondary education, and the wealth of the country. Next slide. And we can see there just quite strong relationships between whether a country has a law and low incidence of early marriage, polygamy, and where there are good economic rights and gender equality in secondary education. So, these are, using that database, which again is not perfect, there are statistically significant relationships between those conditions of gender equality and low incidence of early marriage and polygamy. And there's also, next slide, strong relationship between women's lack of economic rights and preference for some preference, which is really a synonym for female infanticide. And next slide, and also a strong relationship between women's economic rights and women's freedom of movement. So not surprising there, because obviously to be able to participate in the informal or formal economy, one needs to have freedom of movement. But overall, just looking at that data, which is the best that we have, we can see if we can do a probabilistic statement where we can look at what would it be if there was complete gender equality in those conditions, and we can see that all the 6 types of violence against women that are in that index would be very low. So I think that we need more of this kind of work to kind of persuade policymakers that that focusing our strategies on the structures of gender inequality would be the #1 most important strategy for prevention of violence. So just to come to the third and final point of the seminar, really to focus more our thinking on prevention and on, from a WILPF perspective, on what gendered peace might look like. Again, I've already made the point that prevention is almost always sidelined, especially in a security context, when we're focused increasingly on prosecution as the preferred approach to the deterrence of future violence. And I think that this is a problem, that we discuss prevention of violence against women mostly in non-conflict countries, in developed countries, and that, of course, was the theme of the Commission on the Status of Women last year. And even the concept note for that CSW meeting actually explicitly didn't address conflict-related situations or countries as if there was different causes there. But I actually think it's really important to think about both situations because both conflict and non-conflict countries are affected by gender inequalities, but I think that gender inequalities are actually an increasing gender inequalities and rapid change in the status of women and rapidly increasing gender discrimination are all early warning factors for generalized violence and conflict in the society. And I think the best research we have, unfortunately, doesn't get very close at looking at prevention. So sometimes we only are looking at whether a state has a law as prevention or whether there are education programs. And so I think that we need to get better at understanding, what are the conditions for prevention. So, and we need to keep the momentum going. So, just to go past the slide on time to act, I think the Global Summit on Prevention of Sexual Violence taught us that we need to keep the momentum going, and justice is not only legal justice for victims, but economic and political justice too. So let me just sort of finish by just talking a little bit more about some of the ways, some of the strategies for preventing violence. So the first one I just want to mention is this recommendation that was put forward by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in 2009, and that is to mainstream violence against women impact analysis across all policies. And what that means is that given that, and I've summarized some of these earlier, given that we know something about the risk factors, the determinants of violence against women with respect to access to social and economic rights and resources, we should also be able to look at policies and look at their impact on women's social access to social and economic resources, and we should be able to make predictions about the likely impact of those policies on either increasing or decreasing violence against women. And that we really should be looking at all sorts of policies to see whether they increase the risk factors for violence. So, I mean, I can give some kind of ridiculous examples, but I always think about the example of Vladimir Putin wanting to lower the price of vodka before his election campaign. And I'm sure he wouldn't have been amenable to this suggestion, but of course, lowering the price of alcohol will have a direct impact on increasing violence, because we know that alcohol is one of the risk factors for men's violence against women. It's not the cause, it's one of the risk factors, but policies that that promote that are going to have an impact on violence. So that just being a very simple example. Likewise, a post-conflict policy which is targeting men's employment in the construction sector without a kind of a gender-sensitive approach to promoting women's employment in so-called male-dominated sectors is also likely going to affect the gender economic inequalities in that society, which are also risk factors for violence. So that mainstreaming this kind of violence against women impact assessment before and after a policy intervention could be a really important strategy, especially in societies where there is persistent and egregious violence. Yeah, I mean, I think the other one would be something thinking about something like public housing and how that, and liberalising rents in public housing, how that might affect violence, especially given that we know how important public housing is for victims of violence being able to have an alternative place to live or to be able to stay in public housing rather than be evicted when there is a crime committed such as domestic violence. So next slide, thanks Barbara. The other suggestion is that, and this may well be more meaningful in societies which are already have measures to address violence against women, but I think it's equally important to think about for societies which are just beginning to develop strategies for prevention. So that is the idea that we have a prevention index, and that we actually look at the proportion of funding by government, by donors, allocated to crisis-oriented services, protection, security, and though that proportion of funding allocated to preventative services, to preventative strategies, which would include support and resources for women and girls' economic, social, and political empowerment, education and advocacy for non-violence. Next slide, thanks. And in doing so, we would be able to see how much of the focus is really on the emergency room and how much of the focus is really on addressing the underlying structures and drivers for violence. And I think it could be a really useful advocacy tool in holding governments accountable for their responsibilities to prevent violence against women under CEDAW, with respect to the Women, Peace and Security resolutions as well. And I think it would also focus our minds on using some of those strategies to think about changing the societal norms and being able to budget for changing societal norms rather than just assume that it's going to happen. And of course, to use some of those really important feminist methodologies around gender responsive budgeting. So I just have a slide here of from anti-rape marches in New Zealand, just to remind us that all countries are really trying to hold their governments accountable for preventing violence, and all the institutions in the state for being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So perhaps to sum up what is to be done, I think that there's been a lot of focus in the last decade on the considerable economic costs of violence against women, and that's been really effective in bringing attention to the need for societies to prevent violence, because it costs so much to everybody, not just to women and girls, but to their families, to communities, to business, to government, and so on. But that economic cost analysis doesn't really estimate the benefits of prevention in the first place, and the benefits of really investing in women's empowerment and gender equality. And it doesn't really help us understand what might actually concretely be involved in funding and programming for violence prevention. So I think we need to go much further, and certainly a political economy of violence against women goes far beyond noting the costs of violence or even noticing the economic gains from women's empowerment, but it really is trying to help us to understand the material basis of violence, both with respect to why men perpetrate violence and the situations in which women are most likely to be vulnerable to violence. So to conclude, and to go to my concluding slide, I think prevention is very possible and must be prioritised, and that we have good research from different regions, different countries, that shows us that women's access specifically to economic rights and resources is a structural factor that can prevent violence against women. And that together with women's political agency and political advocacy and voice, this could be a really important focus of the next decade. And the third point, again, is really using the research-based evidence that we have and bringing that together to help us predict and prevent violence. And I just wanted to end by saying that over the next 4 to 5 years, the focus of I'm going to take this political economy analysis and use it to understand the relationship between women's experience of violence in post-conflict societies in Asia Pacific and in the Middle East and North Africa, and how that violence affects women's participation economically and politically. So I'm very keen to work with others who are also working in those regions, but also interested in the relationship between violence and participation. Thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jacqui, for that incredibly interesting and enlightening presentation. I know it's given me a lot of food for thought, and I hope also for our participants. So now we will be moving to our questions or comments section. If you have any questions, please press the little hand icon on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will unmute you and you can ask your question to Jacqui. You can also type in your question under the little question bar also on your control panel, and then we'll read out your question. So go ahead, everybody who has a question, comment, ideas about anything Jacqui has talked about.
I'm seeing lots of tweets, so I know people must have questions.
All right, good. So then maybe I will start off with a question to get people warmed up. Maybe people are shy. So my question to you, Jacqui, is what NGOs that are based in Geneva that are working with especially the UPR and CEDAW can do to really mainstream this political economy approach in their work? Because I know that organizations like us could probably use some help with it. So what would be your main advice using those mechanisms?
So using CEDAW, correct?
Yeah, using CEDAW and maybe the universal periodic table as well.
Well, I think CEDAW provides a very good basis for advancing a political economy understanding and strategy. And I think perhaps even really linking the political, the economic, and the social dimensions of CEDAW, and asking them a question about, you know, what are countries doing to address how are countries addressing violence through addressing the inequalities that women are facing economically and politically. I guess it's kind of having the committee is already drawing out those relationships, but it's also speaking back to the government and asking them, did you consider the impact of this policy, which seems to have had a negative effect on women? Did you analyze the likely impact of that on violence? Did you see any relationship there? And I think that the CEDAW committee has a role in really directing governments to analyze the relationship between those conditions of gender inequality and the especially in relation to the kinds of reports about violence and funding for survivors and funding for prevention that is often highlighted in NGO shadow reports. So I think that's already happening, but I think that that's something that shadow reports could take up more explicitly in linking those two dimensions of CEDAW.
Okay, thank you very much. That did help. So we have another question from Catherine. Jacqui, I'm just going to mute you for 1 second while we ask you the question because we're hearing a little echo. So we have a question here from Catherine. Go ahead.
Hello. First of all, I want to say thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting.
What is most controversial for me is that on one hand we say that we need women to be, economically empowered in order to um, prevent being victims of violence. And on the other hand, we, as we heard, that also threatens men, and so that leads to more violence even again. So how can we, like, what's the gap? How to do to deal with this situation, or like, what do you think about it? All right, Jacqui, I'm unmuting you now again. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks for your question, Catherine. Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's a really tough issue. And of course, one response in some societies would be to say that, um, you know, this is disrupting the kind of gender order. We need to, put women in their place. Girls need to get off the streets, stay home, don't go in those unsafe parts of the city, and blame the victim kind of strategies. Don't, you're taking men's jobs and so on. And I think we've seen some of those responses in some countries, and we can certainly see them reflected in, for example, the Global Values Survey, where people are asked the question about, should if there are limited jobs, should men have the jobs before women? And we still see some societies really strong support for that idea. So what should we do? Because of course, that it's kind of two steps forward and one step back. And I think that's why it's political economy and not just an economic approach. An economic approach would think that just giving more money or improving wealth would be enough to promote better norms, a better society, and less violence. But of course, that is not enough. That we need to actually have a political strategy, and that really addresses the devaluation of women in society and women's capacities and roles, and that promotes gender equality explicitly and gendered awareness of differences that need not be construed as inequalities. So, and I think that the focus of that advocacy and education needs very much to be targeting men and young people. And it also needs to think about, what are the benefits to men in their families and in their communities of women's empowerment, of women's employment, of women's rising status. And I think that has been done in some communities where men come to see, yes, it is a great thing to have more income in the family, and to have my partner involved in the village committee, or and for boys to also be proud of their sisters and their mothers in playing active roles in leadership in their communities, as well as breadwinners. So I think that that the political advocacy for women and that the women's movement support for women's involvement in leadership and in decision making is equally important as sort of improving material conditions and the material resources for women. And I think that I think that it's a question of gender equality education alongside initiatives that really target the economic empowerment of women, but also the political empowerment of women.
All right, thank you, Jacqui. I'm just gonna mute you again when I give the floor to Roseanne Anholt, who is raising her hand. Roseanne, I am unmuting you now, so go ahead. Roseanne, are you there?
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
My question was just how, and if it works, how could economic empowerment of women work in conflict and or refugee settings in order to reduce sexual violence?
All right, so Jacqui, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
That's a great question. Thank you, Roseanne. It's a very practical question. Well, I mean, I think that if we think about refugee camps and IDP camps, they are economies unto themselves. So there are often, sort of services provided in those camps, and some trade and bartering, and some production that goes on. And I would think it would be, and oftentimes some of that is quite conventional. So women offering childcare services or hairdressing or these kinds of more typically feminine issues. But nonetheless, those are providing some kind of an income, some kind of a network between and among women, which is having some effect on empowerment. And I think if that was those kinds of initiatives which provide employment and services within refugee settings were also able to become sort of self-organizing, involve some kind of self-governance that extended out to bring in more girls and women in those communities, but also to think about playing a role in developing sort of initiatives within the camp to address safety issues. I think that there have been some successes there. So it's kind of starting with kind of the economic income generating initiatives, but finding ways to use that those sort of informal economies to also discuss and develop strategies and approaches to address these the issues of violence within the camp. So and to engage more of those who may be experiencing situations, precarious situations, and to develop rules, and that could be be part of the governance of those areas. So, do you have some examples, Roseanne, that you can think of if you're working in particular areas?
Let me unmute Roseanne again. There you go. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Thank you. No, I do not have examples myself. I have no experience in the field yet, so no. But thank you for your answer.
All right. So then we have a couple of written questions. Jacqui, I'm just going to mute you again. So we have a written question from Laura Hare. Sorry if I'm butchering your name. So Laura is asking about the differences in approaching the political economy of violence against women between developed and developing countries. She's asking whether that difference matters and maybe how. So I think she's looking at maybe is the research or statistic different for between developed and developing countries on this subject. I'm not sure, Jacqui, if you want to give that a go. Go ahead, you're unmuted.
I'm not entirely sure of the question, but I think that one way to answer it, do I think that there are different political economic causes or situations of women in developed and developing countries. Of course, there are. They're different, but I think that if we know that women, there's no society in the world where there's gender equality, right? And that every society has gender inequality in socioeconomic and political status. Okay, and then we look at which groups of women and girls are most vulnerable to violence, and I think that again those who are in situations with relative to other women and always relative to men are unequal, that we do see greater vulnerability to violence, both in developed and developing countries. For example, if we think about areas which, I think about in developed countries, for example, where you have restructuring and mass redundancy of a sector. So here where I live, we've got 3 car companies in the next year or 2, which are going to close down. And so all of those workers, and it's a highly male-dominated sector, so all of those workers, some of them will find other jobs, but a lot will lose their jobs. And those families, although Australia has quite a good welfare system, and they will have basic needs, those families will nonetheless be relatively poor and disadvantaged. So then we know that is actually a risk factor, because there will be increased stress in that financial stress in that family, and that's actually a major risk factor for domestic violence. And that one way that men often deal with stress is through alcohol and drugs, so there are risk factors there. Now that's quite a different context to a developing country, but nonetheless, I think that developing countries where there also is struggle to survive, and there also is the impact of sort of destabilizing economic conditions, loss of markets, that we also see some similar kinds of drivers. And I think that women have a harder time accessing economic opportunities often, and those are often in the informal economy, and they're often more precarious. However, there are some similar drivers there, and I think it's important to not assume that the situation of women in developed countries is entirely different from in developing countries. Now, I think that it was possibly another aspect to your question that I haven't addressed, because it seemed to have 2 slightly different aspects to it. Could you perhaps clarify if you're still there?
If you want to, thank you, Jacqui. If you want to further clarify your question, you can just raise your hand or type in clarification, and I'll get it to Jacqui. In the meantime, we have a comment from Lorraine, one of our vice presidents of WILPF, from the UK section. She has a comment. Firstly, she says she's listening in from the UK, and she wants to thank you very much for an excellent seminar, which she intends to follow up through our section to hold the UK government to account using this approach to interrogate or question its austerity measures. We may be in touch, she writes. And that also leads into another question we got in more generally about how the recession, and especially the associated austerity measures in Europe, whether that has led to maybe a visible or measurable rise in violence against women, and maybe if you've gotten some interesting data or statistics from that. Maybe you can answer a bit more broadly, how did these austerity measures impact women differently than men? So I'll let you address that. Go ahead, Jacqui.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Lorraine. And I'm not sure whose name was the second question about the impact of recession in Europe and austerity. Of course, when you do a political economy analysis, it opens you to the largest questions, and so I'm happy to take the big question, although I probably will not be able to answer it in a completely satisfying way. I think that understanding the impact of austerity, of course, it is almost always going to increase gender inequalities, primarily because in most societies the economy is structured by gender, and that women are much more likely to be employed in the state sector than men. And in particularly in the delivery of state services, and that the austerity policies tend to be focused on reducing state budgets and into promoting also privatisation, and to the extent that you have more women employed in the public sector than the private sector, and then also benefiting also from state services to support women's employment, as well as especially female-headed households. There is a disproportionate impact there, but it's true to say that I'm not saying that in every society, every country, women were negatively affected by recession, but that the austerity policies, as a response, have had a negative effect on women and on gender equality. And that, I think, one specific way we can see some impact. And for example, you may have read about male suicides in Greece. Just the huge traumatic impact of the recession there. You don't as often see increased reports of violence, but I think that I think there are reports of increasing violence, and I document some of those in my book, and I have begun to work more on this because I am working on a book on the impact of the global financial crisis at the moment. And there are increasing reports of domestic violence. There certainly were right in the aftermath of the financial crisis, but with respect to austerity, I think what we're also seeing is a cutback in services to support the violence against women's support sector. And I think it's incredibly amazing that in societies that are quite different around the world, that their governments, even though they didn't have a big international meeting on this, they have nonetheless spontaneously, one of the first places that they cut was support for local governments or who are delivering services, battered women's shelters, support for sexual assault survivors. Those services were the frontline services that were cut. And I find that quite amazing that happens simultaneously in a number of countries, in the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, these so-called Anglosphere countries, where the state response was somehow that was not a number one responsibility.
All right, thanks.
I think I'll leave it there and perhaps see if we have another question.
Yeah, we do. We have at least one more question from Japan. Jacqui, I'm just going to mute you again. It's from our WILPF Japan member, Nagako Sugimori. She wishes you all a good morning, and she apologizes for missing the first bit of your presentation. So she missed out a bit on what you presented, especially in terms of numbers and percentages that you gave. But she's asking you about the percentages of violence against women, and how much in terms of numbers she's interested in. Does violence against women go down when the economy goes up? So maybe you can talk about it in terms of where can we find the statistics that you talked about, and yeah, who does that kind of research, and where could someone like Nagako find that information? All right, go ahead, Jacqui.
Okay. I wish I could just simply say, and there's this great research that says when you have increasing GDP, violence goes up or down. I don't think there is that one-to-one relationship. We do know that when there is a recession, when there's mass retrenchment, that violence does tend to increase, and it's partly because of the increase of those risk determinants on individuals and communities, increased financial stress, and which may increase the use of alcohol and drugs, which then increases may have an impact on violence or violence through financial stress and loss of employment. And I think that based on some of those studies, there are some studies on that, and so I can't give you a global percentage, and I can't even give you a percentage for a country, unfortunately. I could definitely refer you to some studies. I think that based on some of these studies, which would be using national statistics in the most developed countries like the United States and Australia, we can do some modelling which is predictive about the effects of changes in the economy, but it's not so much about the impact of increasing GDP or lower GDP. That's not something that necessarily has a direct impact. It's more the targeted impact of particular economic instability, loss, recession, or mass unemployment. Those are the factors that seem to have an effect, particularly on domestic violence. And because we have some data on domestic violence, I can't tell you for all forms of violence against women. And I guess what I'm quite interested in looking at is the impact of economic situations on violence against women perpetrated in public rather than by intimate partners. So I'm happy to, if you send me an email, I'm happy to send you some examples of some studies which potentially might have relevance to Japan. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jacqui. So now would be the time for everyone for last questions. So if you have a burning comment question, now is the time to type it or raise your hand. In the meantime, we have just a comment from Nicole Burstein. She writes, "Thank you, Jacqui, for this excellent seminar." Nicole from Argentina, listening from Australia. So thank you very much, Nicole, for your comment. Any other questions, comments? Otherwise, we'll move to closing. All right, I don't see any.
Barbara, can I say just that if anybody has questions or something, and as something I said, and I of course made a lot of big generalizations, but people would like more specific references, feel free to either send myself an email or Barbara.
Right. Thank you, Jacqui. So with that, we'll close. So I'd like to thank you very much, Jacqui. And now I will give the floor over. Barbara, go ahead. You are unmuted. Go ahead.
Yes, so Jacqui, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation showing how the global economic structures can put women in the position of vulnerability to violence. But special thanks for showing what a political economy approach can bring in terms of prevention of violence, because this is very important, especially from WILPF's perspective. And thank you everybody for joining us. I know that for some of you the timing is a little bit tough is around 1 a.m. in Europe. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop an email to Emma or myself, who will be happy to address them. And also, please make sure to check our websites. You can see them now on the slide, because very soon we'll announce the topic of the next webinar in the end of September. Thank you.